What's up, everyone? Trevor Funk here from the Wellness by Design, coming to you out of the Performance and Healing Center in Santa Cruz, California. Today, we're going to be talking about programming for both off-season and in-season athletes. Now, since I have a pretty decent basketball following in regards to current players, ex-players, recreational, and even some coaches, I'm going to use the sport of basketball as an example. However, the principles and concepts that we're talking about can be applied to any athlete in any sport, coach, trainer, or just the ordinary individual wanting to piece together an effective and specific program for themselves. But before we get into any specific movements and building a program around that, we first need a clear understanding as to what the environment or sport is provoking onto the body in terms of a stimulus, and then the physiological adaptations that occur based upon that stimulus. So, looking at the sport of basketball, what are the stresses and forces being placed upon the body? Meaning, what kind of stimulus are the athletes getting simply by participating in their sport? And then what are the physiological adaptations that occur based upon that stimulus? Well, basketball is a constant state of accel decel and a bunch of jumping, meaning athletes are constantly accelerating their bodies as quickly as they can, and then immediately decelerating their bodies as quickly as they can, in addition to all the jumping. It's very rare to see a basketball player reach their top speed, unlike a sport like track or soccer, where athletes reach what we consider flight phase, and that's just one's top speed. But if you slow it down on camera, it literally looks like they're flying as they cover so much distance in between strides. We don't see this in basketball. There isn't enough time or space on the court for an athlete to reach their top speed. Even in transition, you still have to maneuver around defense, sometimes your own teammates, change direction to find that open spot. If you have the ball, you have to dribble and go east-west to avoid traffic and so forth. So what does this all mean in terms of a stress response adaptation upon the body? Basketball is the stress in basketball places a huge load onto the quads and knees of the athlete. Basketball is what we would consider a very quad dominant sport. That is why you see a lot of knee issues in basketball as opposed to other sports like soccer, where you see mostly hamstrings. So when we're putting together a program, if the athlete's already getting a bunch of stimulus and stress on a specific part of the body just by participating in their sport, you kind of want to do the opposite. Find what they're lacking and what they are missing in their development. And it's pretty clear when you look at a basketball player that they lack proper development of their posterior chain. And that's just the nature of basketball, right? Since it's a high accel decel sport with a lot of jumping, in addition to being taped and braced year round and wearing space boots of a shoe, all of which simply lock up the ankle joint and doesn't allow it to do its natural job, which is to be the initial force absorption, right? And then in addition, most athletes have a very poor movement behavior outside of their sport. They just play their sport and then chill for the rest of the day. So when it comes to basketball, we really want to emphasize developing the posterior chain, the glutes, the hamstrings, and the lower leg complex. And this all has to be addressed in the off season, building the athlete from the ground up, offsetting and preparing their bodies to adequately prepare that environment of basketball when they return. Off season is also a great time to explore different lifts and movements that the athlete responds well to. So if you're going to program a loaded squat, allow the athlete to explore different variations of that squat. Because I promise you, a 6'10" human with incredibly long limbs is not going to be happy under a heavy loaded back squat, as opposed to a front or zerker squat. And then you compare that to a 5'10" point guard and they're just fine. So keep in mind, the exercise selection doesn't really matter. It's the vessel in which the stimulus we want is delivered in. So all we care about is the stimulus that we want that's going to elicit the adaptation that we want. So so if we can find a way to deliver that stimulus in the preference and belief of the athlete, you're going to get the most out of that movement and you're going to see the best results. So transitioning into in-season programming. A key cue here is to emphasize movements and lifting patterns that complement your best athletes. You want your best athletes being the best at the movements and lifts you're prescribing in the weight room. Because remember, we're not training weightlifters, we're training athletes, specifically basketball players. So if your best athletes aren't the best at the movements and lifts you're prescribing in the weight room, you're not going to get that transfer that you want to see on the court, and you're probably doing more harm than good. So last point here, and this may be the most important, and that is we cannot compartmentalize stress. And this goes for any context, but sticking within the sport, what do I mean by that? So we cannot differentiate the stress we see on the court, weight room, training sessions, and then all the stress outside of that sporting environment. So think school, work, toxic relationships, poor nutrition, lack of sleep, poor movement behaviors, tech abuse, and so forth. Because the body doesn't know the difference between stresses. To the body, stress is stress. So all of it has to be taken into account. And without focusing on all the stress outside of a sporting environment, because that's more so the responsibility of the individual, let's focus on the stresses we see in a sporting environment and how we work alongside with that. So most people think, all right, if I have a super hard day on the court, high intensity day on the court, we're going to go light in the weight room. And then the next day we do the opposite and vice versa. However, if we follow that approach, that means we have high stress days every single day. And that's where overload and injuries happen and plateau. So what we really want to do is pair high stress days together. So we not only optimize a high intensity day, but we're also getting a true recovery and off day. So if on Monday you go light on the court, you go light in the weight room. On Tuesday, you have a high intensity day on the court. We're going to get after it in the weight room. And then when we just follow that approach, we optimize high intensity days and we get a true recovery off day. So a quick summary in regards to programming for off-season and in-season. Number one, we need to understand what the environment, what the sport is provoking on the body in terms of a stress response adaptation, and then pretty much program the opposite of that. Number two, find a vessel in which to deliver the stimulus that you want and the preference of the athlete and the preference and the belief of the athlete, and you'll see the most transfer. Number three, remember, we're training athletes, we're not training weightlifters. So the movements and lifts you're prescribing better have a transfer onto the court or you're wasting your time. And then lastly, and this is the most important, we cannot compartmentalize stress. Leaving you with that, Trevor Funk, The Wellness by Design. You have a fantastic rest of your day.